Good morning. So I'm very pleased to introduce our candidates for the position of Associate Professor of Higher Education, Professor Ryan Gildersleeve. Professor Gildersleeve's talk will be on ritual culture, new materialism, and Hispanic serving institutions in U.S. higher education. Professor Gildersleeve's earned his doctoral degree at UCLA, and has been the recipient of several key awards, including from the Spencer Foundation and from AERA, and has attracted multiple external grants to fund his work. On a personal level, I'm thrilled that Ryan's here. I was fortunate enough to be, earlier in both our careers, I was fortunate enough to be colleagues with Ryan. And I feel like I learn from him all the time, and I'm thrilled that he's here. So,
thank you. That was so generous. Thank you so much. It is a real honor to be here. I want to say thank you especially to my friend and colleague, Flo, but also to the entire search committee and to the GSE for having me here this day. I'm looking forward to sharing some cool work with you. I have been engaged in some of this, in the work around ritual cultures and HSIs for a few years now. It's a little bit of a mix between some established stuff that I think we are confident that we have found that is interesting and compelling, and some stuff that we're playing with that I think, particularly post-tenure, I've tried to intermingle my interests and thinking around philosophy and theory, much more so into my ethnographic and empirical work, and I think productive ways to be making shocks to thought in the field of higher ed. And I realize there might be a mix of folks in the room. I've got to say I'm not usually this popular, so but it's nice that you left me the whole front row to feel like my usual unpopular self. So thank you for that. We'll get moving along here. I do have some handouts. Because I'm not that popular, I only have 15 of each. So I hope that this is a community that enjoys each other as company and colleagues, and you don't mind sharing. And we'll get moving along. At one point, I do intend to ask for a few volunteers. You will not have to do anything other than let me take control of either a jacket or a backpack or a purse or something like that. And if nobody helps, well, that's fine with me. It's just going to make it awkward for everybody. So I just want to plant that seed in case there's any go-getters in the room who are excited about like the mutual co-construction of knowledge together by sharing your materials. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit further in a couple slides. I'm going to share about an ongoing research project around ritual culture at Hispanic serving institutions. And then I'm going to try to discuss some implications for the future of American higher education, particularly in the context of Latino and Latino immigrant participation in American higher education. And hopefully we'll have some good productive dialogue and question and answer at the end there. So really quickly, Flo shared a bit about my academic and professional background, so you can just see that I also know how to write it on a slide. I do want to contextualize what I'll be talking about today within my broader research agenda and scholarly interests. I really think about my work as trying to understand and push on how we're conceptualizing post-secondary education's role in a democratic society, and what that means for the opportunities to participate and contribute to democracy. And so in doing so, I draw a lot from anthropology, which is my methodological training, and when I'm doing what most folks would recognize as the empirical arm of my work, it's largely critical ethnographic work. I also engage a lot in critical policy studies. I'm not going to touch too much on that in my presentation today, but I'm thrilled to talk about that with anybody or some of my other projects going on. And then increasingly dealing with philosophy. That initially started with me as a methodologist and drawing largely on philosophical developments, particularly around new materialism and the ontological turn and posthumanism, which are strange words to me still. So we'll talk a little bit about it later, but and just sort of blending all three of those. You can see some of my inquiry concerns are highlighted along here in terms of what I've looked at, what I've considered when strictly doing methodological work, but that's all informing my work that is grounded in higher education, where I've done a lot of work with Latino immigrant communities around access and success and their relationships to the institution of higher education. I've been engaging with Hispanic serving institutions over the last few years. Specifically, post-tenure, I moved into a much more, a space where I became much more concerned around organizational and systemic levels of analysis, far more than individual levels of analysis. That's where my thinking has gone. That's where I think the field of education can really generate some cool and new understandings of itself in order to transform for the needs of particularly our new demographies in the US, but as well as our longstanding racist, nativist, and sexist foundations. The Anthropocene we're not going to talk about in the presentation, but it is a super cool thing, and it is what like a good third of my work is taking shape and form in right now. But it's a little bit much to bite off for just having an hour with you. And then higher ed policy at the end. All right, but today we're talking about ritual culture, new materialism, and Hispanic serving institutions. I want to acknowledge that Brenda Cifuentes is a current PhD candidate at the University of Denver, and she has been really more than simply an assistant on this project, but has emerged as a collaborator and a real joy of a thinker to work with and to bring out to the field and then to bring into analysis sessions and whatnot. So it's been a blast, but she is very much contributing to the work, and I wanted to recognize that today. So the orienting question, however, for this study, and I'll get into the design in a bit, don't fret. I just want you to have a sense of where we're headed. What I'm actually trying to provide some form of an answer to is, how does ritual culture at Hispanic serving institutions configure or reconfigure the relationship between Latino communities and higher education? So it's very much not looking at the individual Latino student experience per se, but trying to understand from an institutional perspective and from a community perspective, how are we intersecting Latino communities and higher education? And what does that mean? What new questions does that draw out for us? And what does higher education need to be moving forward? What has it failed to become in the past? And how can we move toward that? So for folks who aren't familiar with Hispanic serving institutions, they are an emerging institutional, I call it a strata, because it's not really a new typology in the rankings of things necessarily. In US higher education, one of those handouts is from HACU, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, and it provides a really lovely synthesis of some cool facts and figures around HSIs. They've worked for a really long time on synthesizing and put all that together. I figured they did it better than I could in a slide, so I provided you with that resource. The things I like to highlight is that most folks are still a little bit curious that Latinos are over 17% of the overall US population. Their percentages of college-going age and school-age children is actually much higher than 17. But what I find really interesting and compelling and why it's important to pay attention to HSIs is that over 60% of Latinos attend an HSI. HSIs make up between 11 and 13% of American higher education nonprofit institutions today. So 11 to 13% of our institutions are educating 60% of Latino students in the US. They are an important resource that we need to understand better, that we need to think through how do we make them as strong as possible, not just for educating Latinos, obviously, but imperatively for educating Latinos as well. In looking at Latinos in US higher education, by the way, I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker, so I'm going to be reading from time to time, just because it helps me through things a little bit better. But overall, we understand that there's less than a 10% college graduation rate from elementary school through higher education for Latino students. So completing a college degree is not only a significant individual achievement, but a remarkable cultural achievement as well. Researchers interested in Latinos in higher ed have explored the enrollment and persistence of Latinos, the lived experiences of Latinos while in higher education, and the policy contexts that shape Latino opportunity. Common themes across these domains include the persistent underrepresentation of Latinos, the pervasiveness of racially hostile campus environments, and the anti-immigrant sentiment of public policy that most often targets Latinos, though not exclusively, disadvantaging Latino educational opportunity and achievement. Some critical researchers have also focused on the agency and activism of Latino students in higher education, drawing oftentimes on sociocultural theory to examine the agency of family in Latino students' higher education experiences. In some, the Latino experience in higher education is marked as exceptional, remarkable, contested, and dynamic in relation to the dominant power structures of the institution that perpetuate inequitable racial disparities in achievement, participation, and opportunity. Ritual practices emerge from and reconfigure these complicated contexts, building dominant and subversive understandings of higher education through new and dynamic activities, doings, that represent the subaltern Latino immigrant and Latino immigrant experience in higher education. In context here locally, there is a handout that lists the different HSIs that are here in the state of New Jersey, as well as those that are emerging. To qualify as an HSI, you have to have 25% of your undergraduate full-time enrollment identify as Latino, as Hispanic in the census. And to qualify as an emerging HSI, you're considered emerging if you're between 15 and 25%. Once you reach 25%, you can apply to different federal grants if the federal Department of Education will certify you as an Hispanic serving institution. And those grants tend to range from $500,000 to $600,000. The highest I've seen here in the state of New Jersey is $700,000, and they're usually for 3 to 5 years. New Jersey is home to the 7th largest Latino population in the United States, and fully 17.3% of the New Jersey population is Latino. So in that sense, it sort of mirrors the country writ large. And there are technically 1.7 million Latinos, which is 3% of the U.S. Latino population living here in New Jersey. Rutgers, New Brunswick is not on that list of HSIs. You're currently at 13% of your undergraduate FTE in 2015-2016 identified as Latino. So why ritual culture? Why concern ourselves with the pretty parties or the ceremonies or just the things that we do to keep things going and commemorate our different moments on campus? Because they're much more than just pretty parties, because they're much more than just ceremonial events that we hire a planner for. In the anthropology of higher education, we look at ritual because of the interplay between individual, institutional, and systemic characteristics. In addition, cultural analyses are useful for understanding how certain phenomena are made possible and plausible for human experience. This study looking at ritual culture in Hispanic serving institutions is the first of its kind, employing cultural analyses of institutional values and purposes in the context of HSIs. So the sort of golden triad, I guess, or the zenith, I like to say the zenith of anthropology of higher education in higher ed context, research contexts, was really around the turn of the century, with Peter McGolden, Kathleen Manning, and Robert Rhodes all publishing a number of high-profile ethnographic studies of institutions. Peter Magolda recently just published a new book looking at the lives of campus custodians. It's phenomenal. Like, if you haven't read Peter's work, it's just beautifully written and really exposes elements and dimensions of our institutions that most folks never think twice about. And so it's a huge inspiration. I like to consider my work as directly following them, but bringing a much, maybe not much, but maybe bringing a stronger critical dimension and certainly stronger post-structural and ontological dimensions to the analysis. So whereas Magolda's work has sought to understand the more normative values of institutions, he looked at things like ritual and commencement ceremonies, as well as campus tours. As transmitted through culture, my project seeks to understand the oppositional politic and plausible cultural change across and between HSIs as they reconfigure relationships between Latino communities and higher education. To think about this in context of HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions have unique opportunities to reconfigure the cultural relationships between the institution and Latino communities. So I am analyzing ritual culture in HSIs in order to generate these new understandings of how cultural change might occur in service to the contributions from and the promise of opportunities for Latino communities. These new understandings will be useful in supporting institutional transformation to meet the changing needs and demands of American higher education and Latino communities in the 21st century. What I've listed here is just to give you a flavor or a sense of what I mean by ritual culture. On the left side are more normative rituals that probably most people who work or go to school or live on college campuses would recognize as, yeah, those are things that we do every day or things that we do every year, and people just know that it's going to happen, and we generally have a sense of what's going to happen when we go to a commencement, when we go to convocation, and we can recognize ourselves or we can recognize the institution in those practices. No, I lied. 4 slides. Well, there's a lot to get through. Ideas are exciting and powerful. Why not stretch them out? All right, so again, what makes some of my work depart from the work of Manning and Magolda and Rhodes, who oftentimes would bring critical theory to bear in their ethnographic work, is I am also bringing in and putting it into a different sort of framework, looking about the matter of matter, or the mattering of matter. And this is broadly under an umbrella of new materialism, which is a development in continental philosophy and other philosophies, but the collection of movements that identify with new materialist thought generally share an interest in rethinking relationships between discursive and material productions of knowledge. So new materialism abandons dichotomous understandings of human and non-human, or subject and object, in favor of more radically diverse and dynamic processes and flows of vital forces. So the chair can do things to me. It's not just something that I, as a human, act upon. Further, it works from non-anthropocentric ontological assumptions, wherein the human is reconfigured as a produced situation in relationship to broader processes of materialization. As a being, I am not the center of the universe, or humankind is not the center of the universe and autonomous or authoritative over everything else. And in fact, it cannot really be known except in how I intermingle with the matter all around what I consider me. Right? And not just in an esoteric, not just in a psychological sense, but in a very material sense, that I literally cannot exist without the other matter that is external to what I might recognize as my body, right, and my mind. So the focus here is much more on processes of becoming rather than states of being. which is especially attractive to me in thinking about reconfiguring relationships between a social institution like higher education and a long-standing heritage of Latino and Latino immigrant communities who are placed in a really dynamic socio-political situation, particularly where I'm doing work in the American Southwest. One I find really promising and useful theory within the new materialism umbrella is this idea of assemblage theory. And assemblage theory recognizes that there are unknown antecedents to any operative discourse, and the intersecting collection of such discourses produce what it is that becomes an experience. So there's stuff we'll never know that's informing what we think we know, that then mixes up with things that we don't know and produces what we think we're going through. Such a notion of reality emphasizes the historicity and dynamism at any given experience or ritual. Thus, the action of dynamic sets of actants, human and non-human, discursive and material. Oh, and I cut that part off. So I'm sure it's a brilliant end to that sentence, and maybe we'll figure out how to fill it in together through the end of the time. But I do want to also share that in assemblage theory, a subject does not really exist, but rather it's an affect of becoming, which expresses the changes and capacities of any given entity. The change can be physical or psychosocial, emotional or social itself. A becoming can alter more than one given capacity, representing a social production that is non-linear. So that's really important. Its causation is not necessarily that like x plus y will equal z. X plus y might very well equal z, but there can be a parallel outcome where x plus y can also equal x again. Additionally, assemblages can function as territories that have been produced by the effects between relations. What I'm really trying to say there is that we've got this sense of what, say, higher education institutions are meant to look like, or behave like, or act like, or do for the individual and for society. But though that understanding, that sense of what higher education institutions do for the individual and society is something that's produced by the affective qualities of those who participate in it and the materials that constitute it. Again, the emphasis in the process of inquiry then becomes around processes of becoming rather than states of being. I don't hang out with students trying to understand their experience per se, or their feelings or perspectives, but I try to understand how whatever's happening is materializing, both for them, but also of and around them. And the goal is really to make sense of what we are ceasing to be and what we are in the process of becoming. To review, the overall question of the project is around ritual culture broadly. What I'm going to share with you for the rest of this presentation is really focused in on how might subcultural rituals like Latino graduation ceremonies support Latino participation in higher education. It is grounded in critical ethnographic work. There's a really long quote up on the slide there, which is from a chapter that I wrote with Brenda. And this is how we're conceptualizing what ethnography can become within a new materialist frame. Where the ethnographers I'm going to read this, because it's hard to read when people are talking. I don't know why we expect people to do that when you've got somebody shouting at you in the front of the room. But the ethnographer's task shifts from identifying and describing the ready-to-wear culture, subculture, or countercultures of an organization, to wrestling with the cultural practices and self-organizing actants that, when interacting with one another, cartographically disperse onto power, we'll talk about that in a real quick second, in such a way that the organization becomes itself. Onto power, to really shorthand it, is basically recognizing that, like, that handout matters for how you're going to know and how this entire colloquium is going to happen or become something, right? And without it, it would be something different, perhaps. So, over 2 years of working with 3 in-depth case studies in California, 1 research university, 1 regional comprehensive university, and 1 community college, all of which are classified as HSIs, all of which have sought and received federal HSI funding. Additionally, I've worked with 9 other campuses that all but 2 of which are HSIs, looking particularly at this thing called Latino graduation ceremonies, which are parallel ceremonies to celebrate graduation organized by, largely, and explicitly for recognition of Latino academic achievement. Data sources you can read down there. We've got a lot of data at this point. It's really a lot of fun to mire our way through all of that. I do want to recognize, because I'm the white queer dude in the front of the room talking a lot about Latino students and Hispanic institutions and Latino immigrant communities and whatnot. So clearly there's a lot of social identities that come into play in our engagement in the field. And there are also personal histories. I happen to have been raised in the Southwest of the United States. And early on, I think both in my educational background and my professional background, benefited greatly from the rich cultural heritage and the hard work of Latino communities that made my more perhaps direct communities possible to inhabit those spaces and to benefit from. With the privileges that I have either inherited or have worked for, I think it's just a lovely opportunity and an honor to get to work to support and work alongside and with, in solidarity, the support of Latino immigrant and Latino communities, particularly recognizing that the institutions that have supported me do not systemically support them. And we can talk more about that because I failed to insert my quote, which would have summed it all up. All right, so now we're into it. At this point, when I talk about this work, I usually ask for volunteers and it becomes a real interactive sort of thing. But it's only 11 o'clock on a Friday, and I just don't know you guys all that well. So I'm assuming you don't want to come up and trust me to make you do a few things. But I would like to ask if I could just get 4 to 7 coats or booklets or anything that you've got that you wouldn't mind. I promise I will return it in as good of condition as I received it. Thank you. And this won't take very long. Oh, this is perfect. Okay, great. Do you mind if I put this on the floor? Okay, I appreciate that. Do you mind just throwing that on the floor? Great. Do you mind throwing that right next to it? Awesome. And then over here, maybe we'll throw yours. And then I'll throw this one right beside yours. And then Flo's glasses, we're going to put right here. They will not be broken. Okay. This is a graduate. This is a parent. Okay? This is an MC. This is a speaker, like a keynote speaker. Okay? Flo's glasses are institutional dignitaries. Trustees, provosts, deans. You as the body as the gown. You as the body as the microphone. You as the body as the chair. And just ask your body to become that. As well as, in the case of Latino ceremonies, you as the body as the drums of an Aztec dancer. You as the body, your body as the sarape around the neck of the graduate. So with your body, somehow become a sarape, right? it gets really interesting to then build this tableau. So just imagine that you all and I knew each other better, and we'd been hanging out for a while, and you were willing to come up and do this, despite the fact we're on camera, huh? And then I would say, who knows the tune to Pomp and Circumstance?
Yeah.
Da 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 da. You're brilliant. So right, like, so imagine that you were doing that. Let's try that again. You're not afraid, apparently. Go on. Da da da. And you can see your friend who became the sarape, and your friend who became the cap and gown, and your friend who became Abuela's purse, or Abuela with her purse, and your friend who became the speaker or the student, and on and on and on, right? All right, you're good. Thank you. You guys are wonderful. Give yourselves a round. That's awesome. You're all like, thank God I didn't have to be the sarape. The point here is we usually go into trying to understand our rituals, trying to understand our ceremonies by what the people are doing. But in this, we invert it so that our bodies actually have to become the things, and we have to get a little deeper understanding of what the things do and how they are co-constituting what's going on. This is beyond thinking just what's the significance of artifacts, like a good traditional anthropologist should do, which is imperative work and good for other anthropologists to be doing. But this is actually asking more ontologically about the becoming of the ceremony as an equal plane of the becoming of any given student's experience or any given faculty member's experience. So some actual, like, real findings that have been generated thus far through some of this work is recognizing, and this is just, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background here, and then I'll get into some more analysis and some description. But as far as how these ceremonies are organized and coordinated, there's not a lot. If you Google Latino graduation ceremony, you'll find like 3 or 4 articles by me, and then like some magazine and New York Times stuff about, because Harvard finally did one, and when Harvard does something, that's apparently a big deal. UC Santa Barbara's been doing it for 40 years. So, but generally they are organized by mostly student committees. On occasion, there are some few that are students with some really strong staff support, and in the 12 groups in the 12 campuses I've worked with, 3 are run by faculty or staff only committees. Participation ranges from 20 to 800 graduates in each ceremony, with an attendance between 100 and 8,000. So it really varies. That's largely, I mean, I've worked at community college. It's fairly evenly split between research universities, state comprehensives, and community colleges. So the size of those institutions varies as well. But to know that there's an 8,000 person attended Latino graduation ceremony, it changes our thinking a little bit about, like, do these things matter or not, or how significant are they? At one institution, there are actually more attendees to the Latino ceremony than there are to the institution's commencement. The locations tend to be in banquet halls, sports or recreation complexes for those that are much larger, or on-campus sort of outdoor amphitheater spaces. Again, I'm working in California and Texas with this project, so the weather permits often. The budgets, keep in mind these are largely student-initiated or student-run, can range from $3,000 at one community college, all the way up to $40,000 to $45,000 at a couple of the research universities. However, very little of any of that comes from hardline budget dollars in the institution. Whereas commencement at one one University of California campus that I've worked at, spends about $150,000 annually on their institution's commencement. Their Latino graduation commencement is around $40,000, but with no hardline dollars, it's all through fundraising and fundraising efforts, like you sponsor a bar to sponsor you and get people to go drink, and then they give you money. It's healthy. And then, or student government, you can apply for some funding from your student government organizations. Some do have fees for participation, so if a student wants to participate in Latino graduation, they have to pay. Those fees range anywhere from $10 to $80. And then at one institution, the students sort of rake it up. So if you apply early for Latino graduation, you get it for the $80 rate. And if you wait until 2 weeks before, which is their cutoff date, it's $140. But others have a real imperative to keep it free. And the community colleges in particular are like, why would we ever think of charging somebody? We just want people to participate. We just want them to know that this is for them. And on occasion, the VPSA or the Director of Student Life will give some money when requested, but it's not a hardline budget item. In contrast to the institution's commencement exercises, which are used to communicate values and history of the institution, Latino graduations focus almost exclusively on the achievement of students and the support and/or sacrifices of their families. There's a real turnaround in sort of the undergirding philosophy of why the ceremony is necessary. And that is evident in some of the ways in which these ceremonies are distinctively Latino, where they draw upon historical legacies of that immediate community, that geographic environment, and or La Raza writ large. Linguistically, they're more often spoken in Spanish first and translated into English, rather than hiring a translator to roughly translate the English into Spanish. Well, food is oftentimes linked to sort of cultural heritage food, like empanadas, enchiladas, etc. Depends on where they can find catering and whatnot. And the entertainment, all but two opened with some form of like I mentioned, the Aztec dancers, sort of as the opening processional, rather than your alma mater or whatever. What else do I want to highlight? And then back to this notion of it's recognizing and reflecting the distinguished or distinguishing qualities of the family and the graduate. They publish these lookbooks. They're sort of like yearbooks, but they're not the institution's yearbooks. It's assessed with the student, sometimes just at the entry to the event, but oftentimes all the way up to receiving the certificate, shaking the hand, and standing there next to the student who's sharing their at the mic moment. We would never consider any, I don't know what commencement is like at Rutgers, but every place that I've attended school or have worked at, there are such strict rules about who's allowed to, and what you're allowed to wear, and where you're allowed to stand, and who gets control of a microphone and whatnot. So again, serving very different purposes. I'm not knocking institutional commencements, but they very clearly are tied to an investment in the history and perpetuating that history as the trajectory of the institution. Whereas these are really trying to rub up against that in some productive ways and say, hey, this institution is not reflecting, not producing what all that gets catapulted in the production of its own commencement. So we're doing our own thing, our own way. Some musings. So as a ritual practice for some Latino youth in U.S. higher education, the Latino graduation ceremony materializes from months of planning, fundraising, and designing. At some institutions, students elect an executive board in the preceding academic year. At other campuses, the fall term is spent recruiting, planning committee members, and fundraising from local businesses. There's a litany of tasks to complete over the traditional 9-month academic year in preparation for the ceremony. Many student groups seem to breeze through these preparations with or without institutional support. Oftentimes, at some campuses, the Latino Graduation Committee is well respected as one of the most well-run student organizations. This design element builds upon generations of prior Latino graduation ceremonies, as well as ancestral cultural practices and artifacts, the things. While it's simple enough to connect food choices to the cultural and national communities represented in the ceremony, the choice to then use local vendors and or to display their participation and sponsorship in the program or on the tables or with signs outside brings to the fore the intentionality of making this ceremony part of Latinidad, part of La Raza, part of something that historically has systemically been relegated outside of American academe. Latino college graduates. A relational feature of assemblage theory acknowledges that elements function as both content and forms of expression. The designed elements are captured in this way. Thus, it becomes imperative that this ritual ceremony materialize as an expression of not just students' achievement, but the struggle of La Raza in the face and on the grounds, the physical grounds, of the institutions that have been used to relegate them to subaltern status. The design choices bring cultural flows of heritage into contact with institutional flows of what Peter Magolda has named the corporate university, which lots of other folks have talked about, the neoliberal bureaucracy, and then transform temporarily, so in that moment, for that 2 hours or 4 hour higher education, because of their particular status, as opposed to simply recognizing, yeah, we've got more Latinos in more colleges. Some plausible implications. I talked a little bit about retention there. There's also this notion of reclaiming the Hispanic of the Hispanic serving institutions, so moving beyond the numbers, but actually thinking about how do we actually make our institutions more Latino for the benefit of all, and then challenging the hegemony of the dominant practice. Sort of went over there a bit. I want to provide some time for questions, so I think this is actually going to be my last slide for everybody. Yeah. And that when we think about reconfiguring higher education, we're talking about making Latinos part of the fabric of the institution as opposed to an addendum to the institution. And supporting the rituals that happen in order to make that happen, as opposed to pushing them off to the outskirts of campus or pushing the, or underfunding them and expecting Latinos to do extra labor to make them happen, could be really important. Policy-wise, we need to become far more flexible, and what I think this really calls for is recognizing new measures of accountability for higher education, particularly for Hispanic serving institutions. It's not insignificant that families spend more time on college campuses when these rituals emerge and when they have the opportunity to participate in them. And while we welcome families that look like mine on campuses, and we anticipate that there'll be donors in the future or whatnot, we do very little to do that work for Latino communities, and I imagine for a number of other communities as well. But if that could be factored into how we are holding our institutions accountable to the public or to their community, I think that could be really powerful. Practical implications, let's think about maybe putting families first in HSI environments, where there's a long-standing literature that supports the notion that families matter more than the institution does to Latino students, and families come first for them anyway, so why can't the institution also put those families first? And then research and theory, I'm just trying to push harder and lean in more on new materialism and recognize that these things, rather than the bodies of people, hold a lot of value in recognizing how those bodies end up moving through and what they can become. We've got 8 minutes. Who's got a question? Or applause! Who wants to sing again?
You talked about making institutions more Latino. If if one of the institutions you worked with became more Latino, what would characteristics would have that it doesn't have now?
Sure. So first and foremost, all families would have equal opportunity to participate with the life of the institution. Meaning it'd be fine if parents came to class, right? Whether they're Latino or not. So by Latino, I'm not just talking about like Latino bodies being more present in more offices, although that is imperative to happen as well. At most HSIs, the faculty and the staff are still predominantly, like way predominantly white. Even HSIs that have had that status for decades, would have had the status for decades, were around that long. But it's more about these, like the qualities of what these ceremonies are trying to put out there or to invoke that I think is what I'm meaning when I'm saying become more Latino. So things like family involvement across the board, not just in particular targeted weekends or targeted events. Other notions are really linguistically, like in a country like the United States, I get that English is predominant, I get that that's true globally, but almost all of our peers in Europe or in other parts of the globe, universities are multilingual. Like the US is fairly unique in having monolingual universities. If you look at the list of world universities that are ranked every year by the various ranking regimes, I mean, those at the top outside of the US are all multilingual institutions. Those are a couple ideas. Mm-hmm.
One maybe suggestion is to look at HSIs in Puerto Rico, because there's a great number of universities obviously in Puerto Rico. I think it's all of them that have applied.
They're all universities
HSIs,
in Puerto Rico are HSIs. Mm-hmm.
To look at first, language for graduation is not in English.
Right.
All in Spanish. And to look at what is inherent in those rituals that are situated in universities there that might be comparable or not, because there's some that behave with the American model and some that behave with the Hispanic model of graduation. Then the other thing is, and you brought it to fruition in my head when you said the song of pomp and circumstance. I may be an American citizen, but I didn't know what you were talking about, see? So I've never been, and I went to my own graduation in pomp and circumstance. I may be an American citizen, but I didn't know what you were talking about, see? So I've never been, and I went to my own graduation and forcibly went because I didn't partake, I didn't feel part of the ritual. Yeah. And I just learned that that song is probably something that's inherent in all graduation ceremonies in the United States, but that necessarily wasn't in mind in Puerto Rico. So there are a lot of models, I think, that could benefit from sharing. The other unique thing, which I like your research about, is that it's centered in the Southwest, which means that you have Hispanic, and though probably not all empirically true, but you have Mexican Americans, Chicanos, whereas if you come to Rutgers, Rutgers is with the Hispanic culture, you're going to find Guatemalans, you're going to find Mexicans, you're going to find Puerto Ricans, you're going to find Dominicans, Hondurans, you're going to find Ecuadorians. So it's not that one monolithic model might be able to
absolutely.
fit. Yeah, so
no,
how
I
would
think
you,
that the distribution of diversity in the Northeast is so radically different than the distribution of Latino diversity in the Southwest, which I think would be super exciting to see. How does this materialize in the different contexts? There's so many different cool ways of looking at those movements and flows of how rituals end up mattering, that I just think it's sort of an endless wealth of like so exciting to think through and to engage with folks around. So I love the idea of going to Puerto Rico especially, and right now more than ever, as they're largely rebuilding those institutions, and the institutions are confronting, so what does it mean to be an institution of higher education in Puerto Rico post-disaster? Probably have time for one more if anybody. Yes.
I just want to say, Ryan, I have several colleagues who knew materialism, and you're the first person I've actually listened to that has put it into the context of practicality. So thank you.
I'm deeply appreciative. Cool. Well, thank you all. It's an honor to be here and to join you today and to spend time with you.